Vikings truly have the best names for everything, and their punishments are no exception. From the Blood Eagle to the Fatal Walk, Viking naming conventions really do their best to convey the grisly nature of their torture practices. In this video, we're going to look at one they called hung meat. Welcome to the Viking Vault. Torture in Viking sagas. Although sagas are notoriously fickle as accurate sources of historical fact, they still remain one of the most important and abundant bodies of information that we have about the Viking Age. It's important to remember that the sagas don't represent the entirety of Viking society. The Viking Age lasted for centuries and spanned multiple countries across oceans, so when discussing one set of sagas, the acts and belief systems represented there might not be accurate representations of what another community in another time period would have condoned. Iceland was a curious microcosm in terms of its representation of Viking society, as well as remembering that everything we know from that point has been passed through a filter of Christianity. The earliest sagas about the history of Iceland are known as the family sagas and tell the story of the settlement and establishment of Viking towns in Iceland until about 1030 AD. The difficulty that people faced when settling Iceland is that they had no king, no overall ruler, and no real sense of how to enforce laws in a lawless land. This sense of uncertainty and fragility is clearly reflected in the stories told in the sagas. When people are afraid, they often turn to violence, and the Icelandic Vikings are no exception. The bloody feuds, excruciating torture methods, and overly rigid social structure depicted in the Icelandic sagas seem to indicate a concerning level of violence, but was that truly the case for medieval Iceland? With all that in mind, we can start looking at the Viking torture practice of hung meat. What was it? According to the sagas, hung meat was a brutal torture method where the victim's heels were pierced and then threaded through with a length of rope. The victim was then strung up and left to suffer, although not to die. It's hard to know whether or not this practice would have ever been used in real life. Hung meat is only mentioned in one saga, Rafnkel saga, which tells the story of the feuds between landowners and farmers in 10th century Iceland. Rafnkel, the protagonist of the saga, is outlawed and all his property becomes forfeit. However, he was a powerful man and had connections that meant he would not give up so easily, at least not until he was subdued. In an attempt to keep him out of the way while his property was confiscated, the group of men who had broken into his home decided to hang him up by his ankles in exactly the way we just described. Pierced ankles, threaded with rope, and then hauled up to dangle from one of the beams in his house. Astoundingly, this torture method didn't kill Rafnkel. He survived and went on to seek revenge on the men who had stolen his property and mutilated him. Fair enough. Rafnkel's saga. Icelandic sagas straddle an uncomfortable divide for many scholars and researchers, not quite fiction and not quite fact. They make up a large proportion of what we know about the Viking Age, and yet we can't really trust what happens in the sagas, as they often don't have corresponding evidence in the archaeological reference to back up the stories being recounted in them. Rafnkel's saga is no exception. The main character is Rafnkel himself, and the saga follows his life after he settled in Iceland at 15, tracking his growth from an ambitious teenager to an unpopular chieftain who likes to bully others, get into duels, and then refuse to pay the weregild after he kills the other person. Rafnkel holds a high-ranking position, though not only as chieftain, but also as guai, a position he holds thanks to his religious duties. He builds a lavish temple, dedicates his most prized possessions, and performs extravagant sacrificial ceremonies for Freyr, his patron god. Rafnkel is many things, but no one can say he isn't an animal lover. Rafnkel is so dedicated to his favorite horse, Freyfaxi, also dedicated to his patron god, that he swears that he will slay anyone who even rides Freyfaxi without his express permission. And this is where the saga gets a little spicy. One of Rafnkel's shepherds needs to get some work done and needs a horse to get him to where he needs to be. But all of the horses keep running away from him. So Einar, the aforementioned shepherd, does what any sane Viking would do and just decides to use his master's prized horse for his daily errands. After the day's work, the horse returns home and starts neighing, getting Rafnkel's attention and making him realize that somebody had the audacity to ride his favorite horse. Sound ridiculous yet? It gets worse. Rafnkel reluctantly kills Einar to fulfill the oath he made to kill anyone who rode his horse, and then refuses to pay the Wergild afterwards when Einar's father demands it for the death of his son. Rafnkel tries to settle out of court and make amends with Einar's father, but he wants nothing less than full satisfaction from Rafnkel. Einar's father tries to get support from the other Guais in the area as he'd need them to help with the legalities at the thing, but no one wants to tangle with Rafnkel and deal with the fallout. Eventually he gets his nephew on board and they prepare their case at the upcoming thing. Rafnkel is thoroughly defeated in the case, meaning that all his property is now forfeited to Einar's family as well as his life. This brings us to the point of the hung meat torture. Rafnkel was a man with a quick temper who wouldn't back down without a fight and wouldn't sit back and watch all his prized possessions be carried away. Remember, this is the man who swore he'd kill someone for sitting on his horse. The family broke into Rafnkel's house and chose the very convoluted method of hung meat to keep him out of the way while they took his stuff. Was it possible? Of all the Viking torture methods, this one is the most physically possible. The Blood Eagle would likely have killed someone far too quickly to be used in the way it's been described, while hung meat might actually be possible. Looking at the text in the saga where the torture method is described, it says, quote, "They took Rafnkel and his men and bound their hands behind their backs. After that, they broke open the storehouse and took a rope down from some hooks. They then took their knives, pierced holes through the men's heels behind the tendons, and dragged the rope through these holes. They threw the rope over the beam and strung the 8 of them up together." While you may think that it sounds unfeasible to support a person's weight entirely by their Achilles tendon, the human body is a phenomenal thing, and our Achilles tendons are actually capable of supporting up to 8 times your body's weight while active. Another reason why this could be physically possible is that many cultures all string up animal carcasses in this exact manner, by inserting hooks between the tendon and the bone. Was it just poetic license? As with all the sagas, we have to bear in mind that this text is often written down after the fact and has gone through many iterations and translations. In fact, sometimes the translation is wildly different from the original text. The original author of Rafnkel's saga is still unknown. It was written in Iceland and it's likely to have been transcribed by a Christian cleric, as the tone and turn of phrase shows a religious perspective. If we can trust that this saga was in fact written by a cleric, then it's possible that the story itself and the torture in it were exaggerated to show the barbarous nature of the Vikings and the repercussions of their actions. Some elements of the saga make it unreliable as a source of information as to whether this practice ever occurred though. Although Rafnkel's saga is often seen as an accurate representation of oral history, the way that the laws are talked about in the saga doesn't match with other more reliable sources like the Grey Goose laws. While it's easy to assume that Vikings were all barbarous warriors who used torture on a regular basis, the facts always show that it's far more complicated than that. We can't say that Vikings didn't do horrible things to each other, they absolutely did. But we can't assume that everything in the sagas is a faithful or accurate representation of the past, especially when it comes to torture methods. Getting hung by your heels while everyone steals your stuff sounds horrendous, but maybe Rafnkel truly deserved it. Or perhaps it's all just to enforce the moral of the story. Pay up when you kill someone if you don't fancy a new ankle piercing. Thank you so much for watching this episode of the Viking Vault. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying these videos, and I'll see you next week for another one. Until then, have a great week. Cheers!